Good morning, everyone. My name is Natalie Pinero, and I'm the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships with the NJRA. And I'm excited to welcome you on behalf of our entire team to another NJRA Training Institute session. Understanding how various tax credits play into your funding strategy is an important aspect of planning and advancing your projects. And we're excited to have a panel of incredibly talented experts to educate you all on how and why you should do just that. We encourage you to ask questions using our chat or Q&A feature. Our lovely host, Venitra Lewis, will be monitoring these tools and will jump in to present your questions to our speakers. And remember, don't get bogged down by taking too many notes, as our presenter slides will be made available to you shortly following the session. I would now like to turn it over to Leah Sandbank, who will give us a brief overview on tax credits before jumping into her own area of expertise, new market tax credits. Leah concentrates her practice in the areas of real estate finance and development, tax credits and incentives, public finance law, and tax. Her practice focuses on complex commercial real estate transactions for development projects throughout the state, financing, utilizing state or local government lending programs and incentives, federal tax credit programs, representation of the state of New Jersey and its agencies and authorities, and issues involving federal income taxation of municipal bonds and related tax areas. I'd like to turn it over to Leah.
Thanks, Natalie. Hi, everyone. I'm Leah Sandbank. I'm a member of the law firm of McManaman, Scotland and Bauman. And given that introduction, Natalie, it makes sense why I feel so busy all the time. But welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to NJRA for hosting this webinar and for inviting me back to talk about tax credits. I'm excited for this panel, and I'm excited to share this panel with my esteemed colleagues. I am going to share my screen and then we will get started. Okay, so we are here to talk about understanding and incorporating tax credits in your project finance strategy. Long title, but an important topic. There are multiple tax credits. We're going to be talking about the three big ones today: new markets tax credits, low income housing tax credits or LIHTC, and historic tax credits. I can't see you, so I can't take a show of hands for who has experience in these credits, but feel free to make a comment in the chat or the Q&A if we need to either back up a little bit or can kind of move forward. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to run through a lot of these topics fairly quickly, and then hope at the end we have some time to answer questions. The reason I laid out sort of a very brief overview of the three tax credits, you'll see the NMTC is the federal tax credit for financing commercial and some mixed use projects in low income communities. It does have a very broad applicability, and it really comes into your project as a loan and can be used for a project financing gap, generally not to finance your entire project budget. The low income housing tax credits, or LIHTC, is also a federal tax credit program to finance residential rental housing projects that meet certain affordability restrictions. So the applicability of this tax credit is only to affordable housing projects, and the equity of the tax credit comes into the project owner in installments. And then the historic tax credits, also a federal tax credit program to finance the rehabilitation of certain qualifying historic buildings. And again, the applicability here is to rehabilitation of historic buildings, and the equity comes into the project owner in installments. So the reason I set it out that way, you'll see there's a lot of similarities in the structuring of the credits as between the LIHTC and the historics, the way that the investor actually is able to claim their credits, some of the tax considerations, such as needing a taxable project owner are very similar between the historic and the LIHTC, where the new market has a little bit of a different structure, where the investor is not directly a part of or involved in the actual project or project ownership. A lot of these tax credits can be twinned or combined, some more easily than others. The historic is, I guess, sort of the most malleable and can be twinned with new markets and LIHTC somewhat easily. The new markets and the LIHTC is the hardest to kind of twin or put together in the same project, given that the LIHTCs are just for affordable or just for housing, and the new markets, there's a restriction on using them mostly for residential projects, and we'll get into that. So the bigger question is, why do we need tax credits, or why do we want tax credits in our project financing strategy? So anyone who either has a project ongoing right now, is thinking about a project, might have read a newspaper article or otherwise just be paying attention today, is aware that interest rates right now are unstable and rising. Construction costs are increasing. Lending terms are weak and require too much collateral or guarantees. And there's refinance risk because a lot of those lending terms are fairly short term. We have supply chain and labor issues coming off of COVID. Those have really been exacerbated, and that means a lot of construction delays. And so those delays and all the increasing construction costs means that more contingency is required. So all of these increasing costs and doomsday scenarios means that your project is costing more today. And increases now in your project budget means there might be a financing gap. So the tax credits can really create a substantial subsidy in the form of equity for your project. And again, that equity is not necessarily available on day one. Historics and LIHTCs work a little bit more with sort of that full equity kind of coming in by stabilization. And with the new markets, that equity really becomes a permanent source of your capital stack after the end of the 7-year tax credit compliance period. Okay. So let's give an overview of the new markets tax credits. It has been around since 2000. So it's a somewhat seasoned program. The benefit to the investor for the new markets is a 39% tax credit, which is taken over 7 years. And that 7 years in this case is taken from when you sort of close your new market transaction, not after your project is placed in service. The most important thing to know about the new markets, again, if I could see you, I'd take a show of hands for who has heard of some of the terminology and the acronyms. That usually is what most people know about new markets. And it is the most important thing to kind of have a good feeling for. So your tax credit investor through an investment fund makes a qualified equity investment, which we call a QEI, into a community development entity, that's a CDE, who then makes a loan or a qualified investment in a qualified active low-income community business, or as we call it, a Qualic B. The Qualic B is your project owner. And the idea of the project, of the whole program, is really to get investment into low-income communities that generally have a harder time attracting investment. And there needs to be sort of a better rates and terms for the sort of new market loan. And I'll explain how the money comes in as a loan, but that loan is generally long-term. It's 7 years interest only. The interest rate is a below market rate interest. You have much more flexible terms than you would if you walked into a bank in terms of your coverage ratio requirements, loan to value, ratios. So it's a much more flexible loan product. And at the end of the 7-year compliance period, a portion of the loan, which is associated with the tax credit investor's actual equity investment, stays in the project sort of as equity. And then you have some refinancing of your permanent debt. So this results generally in a 15 to 20% sort of advantage or subsidy over if you finance your entire project with conventional financing. We'll talk a little bit about sort of pricing and how pricing has significantly decreased, certainly over the last 5 years. I think maybe Chris and John will make the same comment with respect to respectively the LIHTC and the HTC as well. So there's lots of benefits. One thing to know about new markets is that they are time consuming. This is not as quick as walking into your local bank and asking for, just a straight commercial loan. These are federal programs. They are incorporated into the tax code. They have particular program requirements and significant sort of tax structuring needs. And that complication can turn some developers off if they just don't have sort of the time and the energy and the sophistication to take on a new market transaction. I do with my clients sort of say this may not be the best program for you, notwithstanding the subsidy, if you're really not going to have the capacity to sort of take the time and deal with the tax and the structuring issues and really understand how the modeling works. The one nice thing about new markets is they can be used by nonprofit entities much more easily than the LIHTC and the historics. I do a lot of charter school and other nonprofit financing, and we do use new markets for those types of projects a lot. Okay. So as we said, the investor benefits being this 39% tax credit over 7 years, and it's considered because it's a low income community investment. There's like CRA credit, and we talked about the business benefits to the project themselves are these sort of favorable terms. This gap financing, which can plug into your capital stack. Again, the sort of nut equity could be about 20% of your capital stack. Again, high cost, complicated structuring can be a sort of con or a negative to using this program. Just some real quick overall benefits of the program. There has been $56 billion of new market award investments into low-income communities, creating or rehabilitating 231 million square feet of commercial real estate. So that's kind of cool. It is important to note the program technically expires at the end of 2025, but we've heard that before. There have been permanent bills introduced now for a while. The Congress seems to keep kind of giving these 5-year extensions of the program rather than making it permanent. So we are in, I guess, sort of the middle-ish of a 5-year extension where the allocations are $5 billion of award in each year. So the last award, September 2021, the $5 billion was awarded to 100 CDEs. And that was from a pool of 208 applicants with a request of over 15 billion of allocation. So all that to say that are more projects wanting allocation than there is allocation for the credits. And we'll go into the structure. You do need an allocatee with an award, and probably that's the hardest part of this whole thing, is finding an allocatee that has the amount of allocation and who wants to give it to you for your project. Okay, talked about this. So here's our very basic structure. You have your tax credit investor. That investor buys a 99.99% equity interest in this CDE, community development entity, by paying cash. Okay, this qualified equity investment of $1 million is then used by the CDE to make a loan or investment to our qualified active low income community business. And this $1 million of investment winds up totaling $390,000 of tax credits that the investor can claim in each of these 7 years. Okay. So the CDEs are domestic corporations or partnerships that have applied to the CDFI fund for certification as a CDE. You can go onto the CDFI fund website and get a list of all of the qualified CDEs. And the CDEs have to invest pretty much all of the monies that they receive from the tax credit investor into the Qualic-B, and that money has to stay invested for the 7 years, which really just means that there's no prepayment. So you close your transaction and it really stays as is for those 7 years. So you need to be a little careful if you are a developer who's doing a build to suit type project with a lease with maybe a purchase option. Don't expect that you'll be able to have someone else assume the debt or refinance or prepay that new market loan for the full 7 years. Talked about the equity investment. Again, the CDE is making a loan or investment into the Qualic-B. Your low income community, again, the CDFI fund has a great mapping tool. You can go in online, you can plug the address right into the mapping tool and it'll tell you immediately, zero in if that address is in a qualified census tract meeting the low income requirements for the new market program. Then your business, the actual operating owner entity must be a corporation, again, which can be a nonprofit. Partnership or proprietorship has to be engaged in an active trade or business and expect revenues within 3 years and have most of its business activity in the low income community. Most of these projects are single purpose entities that are going to own the project and undertake it. So their only asset is the project, which is de facto in the qualified census tract. So it qualifies as a low income community business. There are restrictions. There's sort of sin businesses and no farming, and we'll get to sort of the restriction on residential rental project. But again, most sort of businesses qualify as real estate entities or developers who are going to acquire and construct or rehabilitate a project and then lease it to somebody else. And again, they're a special purpose entity. Their only asset is the project. They don't have employees and services. If your business is more of an operating business and you have multiple locations, then you do have to be more aware of these sort of 50% and 40% rules about gross income, tangible property, and services needing to be performed solely within the low income community. So that gets a little bit more complicated on the tax side to confirm that you do have a qualifying Qualic-B. Okay. Non-qualified financial property, it's just one of these rules in these deals that there has to be in any year during the compliance period less than 5% of what's called non-qualified financial property. And the most important non-qualified financial property are loans and cash. So the Qualic-B cannot hold loans, cannot make a loan and then hold that loan, and it cannot hold cash. So you're probably wondering, well, I just got cash because I closed a new market loan for my construction project. What do I do with that? So there is determined to be an exception, a safe harbor for the new market loan to be held in cash during your construction period. The safe harbor is 12 months. So we do get into needing to do some additional analysis if we have a construction period that's significantly longer than 12 months and needing to make a determination that it's still reasonable to hold those funds for that purpose. So the ineligible Qualic B activities, the big one is really the operation of residential rental property. It is not a flat prohibition on having residential rental property, but at least, or no, we could say it either way, no more than 80% of your gross rental income it comes from the residential units. The other way of saying it is at least 20%, and it probably with tax councils and all the rest who are very conservative these days needs to be much closer to 30%, needs to come from the commercial side. So if you do have a mixed use project of residential and commercial, there will be a lot of attention paid to sort of your income and how you maintain compliance with what we call this 80-20 test. And as we said, there are certain sin businesses that the property cannot be used for: golf course, racetrack, gambling, actual farming activities, and a store with the principal business is the sale of alcohol for off-premise consumption. And you can't run, right, the golf course, country club, massage parlor, hot tub facility, suntan facility, gambling, or the liquor store. So those are sort of known generally as the sin businesses. You cannot use the property for that. Just of note, because I know there has been some discussion as to whether you can use this program for a store that sells cannabis products. Again, I think if it's a truly real estate business for lease, yes, maybe. Again, I think it's totally going to depend on who the councils and who the parties are on in the project as to whether there's a thought that that might conflict with some other laws that someone doesn't want to be involved in. I see there's something in the chat. So for building a 40-unit building only residential, you can't use it. That's correct. If you have 100% residential building, you cannot use new markets. Okay. There is recapture if the Qualic B fails to sort of maintain those requirements as to being solely a business in the low income community, not having non-qualified financial property, not having a sin business. It is subject to recapture. I'm really not aware of a sort of recapture guarantee being called upon in this program. It just does not really happen because the Qualic B, again, is generally a special purpose entity that's just undertaking this and maintains those requirements. Yes. I'll pause.
There's another question in the chat. It says, can we use to build factory buildings?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, office, factory, manufacturing, warehouse, distribution, straight retail, office, school facilities. Yeah. Other than again, those sin businesses and farming and the prohibition on 100% residential, as long as you are a business and you have expect to have revenues within 3 years, you can use this. Okay, so hold on, I want to go back. Okay, here is our sort of simple new market structure. Anyone who has actually done one of these knows that they get quite complicated. So we're just going to back up and sort of go through the basics using this simple structure, and then we'll have fun playing around with a slightly more complicated structure. Okay, so this is our Qualic B is a non-profit developer who's building a school. Somehow they're able to build a school for $10 million, but we did that so the numbers are nice and round and easy. Okay. So because we're gonna have a $10 million project, we're gonna have a nice flat $10 million equity investment into the sub CDE. That results in our tax credit investor putting in equity. Okay, so they get to claim a tax credit of 3.9 million over the 7 years. That's the 39%, right, of the $10 million. Fine. But they're not paying $1 per credit anymore for those tax credits. They're now paying probably somewhere in the mid 70s, maybe up to low 80s, but really more like mid 70s these days for tax credit equity. So they're going to put into the investment fund $2.5 million. Okay. Then in order to get a $10 million investment, you need a loan for the rest of it. Very rarely will the new market investor put in 100% of the QEI. They really want someone else to kind of take the bulk of the risks. And they just want to sort of put in what they need to claim their credits and maybe take the credit risk, but not sort of act as a lender and take other construction and other sort of lending risk. So there is a what we call a leverage lender who puts up the rest of the money. In this case, it would be $7.85 million. This generally is a commercial type loan. It can have a commercial interest rate. It can have a 7-year term. The biggest issue with the leverage lender is they do not have collateral in the project itself. What they get as security for their loan is an assignment of the investment fund's, 99.9% membership interest in this sub CDE. Okay, so that's sort of one key issue, is sort of who's going to serve as leverage lender and be able to accept only that collateral. It could be a bank who's involved in some other aspect of this project, like maybe it's really a $20 million project. And a bank is already putting in a $10 million, first mortgage loan into the Qualic B and agrees to serve as leverage lender. It could be someone related to the Qualic B who maybe has some other collateral they could give the leverage lender. So that's one of the key kind of questions or issues. There are some sub CDE entities and in particular, I mean, New Jersey Community Capital is one of the New Jersey specific CDEs that does a lot of new market deals and uses their collateral. And sometimes maybe they would be willing to serve as a source lender or leverage lender. We do, as we said, need somebody, one of these CDEs who has allocation from this $5 billion round for this QEI. So this CDE had allocation for the $10 million QEI. In order to give you allocation to do this whole nice project, they're going to take a $400,000 allocation fee that comes usually from the investment fund. So the reason why this is $7.8 million is because the 7.857 plus the 2.542 is what we need to have a $10 million QEI and a $400,000 allocation fee. So this investment fund is making their $10 million equity investment into the sub CDE. They are buying the membership interest of 99.99% of this company. So they control this sub CDE, and then they are making a $10 million loan to the Qualic B. This loan looks very much like a standard loan other than having more of the flexible rates and terms, but it will have a loan agreement, a promissory note. It'll be secured by a mortgage, an assignment of leases and rents, a UCC security agreement. There may be completion guarantees. environmental indemnities, assignments of your, construction contracts and permits and plans. So really looks like a commercial loan transaction. This loan is usually evidenced by two promissory notes, what we call the A and the B note. And the reason for that is the A note matches your leverage loan amount and your B note matches your equity. And the reason why you can have a below interest rate down here with the $10 million Colicchio loan is because repayments of that loan will run upstream. Imagine these arrows then run back up for repayment and need to pay the $7.8 million leverage loan. So maybe $10 million at a 4% interest rate, right, gets you enough cash at repayment to pay your $7.8 million leverage loan at 6%. So I know this is a lot. This is as simple as this structure gets, which again is why this program may not be for everyone and why you need really good sort of consultants and counsel to really help you understand each of these steps and what they mean and where the dollars go, most importantly. Okay, so to have fun, here's a case study too. This is our residential mixed use project. Okay, this is a $50 million project, so it's a little bit more it's a bigger size, so it's more complicated, right? But again, we have our new market tax credit investor at the top in red. They are making an equity investment of $16.5 million down into our investment fund. Here we had only two CDEs because you'll see sub CDE 2 actually had a $40 million allocation. You will not find that today. You're gonna, it's really hard to find anything much more than, 10 to maybe 15 million of allocation from a single sub CDE. So to do a $50 million deal today, you potentially would have 4 sub CDEs here. Okay. So because we have 16.5 of equity and a $50 million project, we need to come up with $34 million of leverage sources. In this case, we had a fee owner and our Qualic B was actually the ground lessee. So our fee owner was able to give a fee mortgage to a senior lender sort of outside the new market structure. Senior lender gave a first mortgage. There was a bunch of government money, some securitization of payments in lieu of taxes. And all those sources that went into the fee owner were then used as leverage into the investment fund that gave us a $40 million QEI and a $10 million QEI that then ran down to our Qualic B and gave them, I don't know why it's 49. Apparently I lost $1 million somewhere, but gave them $50 million of project costs. And again, you'll see these multiple notes sort of trace back to different sources of the leverage debt, right? So Colicchio loan C, 23 million is really will run up and be allocated sort of to that senior loan on the leverage lender side. Okay. So this was a large multi-building project. There was I think it meant multi-unit project. There were multiple buildings, and they all had residential rental units with retail on the ground floor, right? We talked about sort of all these multiple sources that went into the leverage loan. And in order here, because we had a mixed use project, in order to meet the 80-20 test, the developer master leased all of the commercial space to a single sort of commercial master tenant who then would go out and sublease it to the actual end users. And so with that master lease, we were able to make sure that that revenue that was coming from the commercial side was always at least 20% of the total income, including the income that came from the residential units. Different tax credit investors have very different sort of thoughts and levels of conservativeness with whether a sort of master leasing structure would be acceptable to meet the 80-20 test. So the obstacles were, again, figuring out how to meet that test. This fee owner, remember, the leverage loan funds don't have security in the project. So our senior lender who's making the loan to the fee owner wanted access to control, the construction draws, oversee the project. So we had to kind of deal with that obstacle. There were a bunch of government funds used as leverage. So each of those loans came with their own sort of set of requirements. When you have a ground rent, even though it's between two either, related parties, each transaction really has to stand on its own. It has to have economic substance. Someone probably has to give a true lease opinion. So those ground rent payments have to be fair market value. So there was a lot of tax considerations as well as dealing with intercreditor type issues between the fee lenders and the CDEs. But this was a deal. Not only did we get it done, but we have since unwound it. It's gone through its tax credit period. So it's a beautiful project right now. So this is a very similar project, but with a slightly different structure. So this is also a mixed use project with a project size of $40 million. Here, the tax credit investor would not let us meet the 80-20 test with a master lease. So we created condominium units, and I'm sure Chris and John might talk about the use of condos if you did have a twinning structure. One way to do a fully residential and a mixed use or fully commercial project is to create condominium units, because each unit is its own project. Okay. So here our residential condo was, let's say, floors, 5 through 7 of the residential building, and we're 100% residential. Our commercial condo was all of the ground floor retail and maybe 1 or 2 floors of residential. So it was mixed income, but with the vast majority of income coming from the commercial sources. And we called it a commercial condo. And we had then the fully residential condo. And again, our residential condo owner was actually able to serve as the leverage lender and use some of those sources that it got to make the leverage loan. But note that splitting the project in this way means you can only use the new markets, and sort of your equity here is much lower. It was only 3.5 million instead of the 16 million of equity on the last slide, because it could only be used for the commercial piece, which was much smaller than the residential piece. Okay, so lost some value of equity by doing this structure, but it was required for tax purposes. Again, you need to deal with bifurcating your project and how you allocate sources, and how you sort of allocate, profits and revenues are now separate with 2 sort of separate owners of each condominium unit. So that was an issue for the developer. Okay, so let's just talk for a minute. I know we're running out of time about how to access new markets. Again, that generally, if you're starting out, you're like, oh, I think I want to use new markets. I would say the first thing to do is maybe find a consultant who can help you. And then to maybe noodle around and try to find CDEs. And the CDEs, a lot of them have connections to the investors, so can maybe sort of help bring a whole deal with all the parties together. They may know other CDEs who are willing to participate. So the CDFI Fund website is probably the best place to go, where they have a whole spreadsheet and table with the CDEs who have received new market allocation. The CDEs have 5 years to fully deploy their allocation. So even if they didn't receive a sizable allocation in the most recent round, they may have some leftover allocation from a prior round or a deal that didn't go through. Active CDEs that are applying for allocation every year really like to fully deploy all their allocation within the year, because that makes their application stronger to the CDFI fund for why they should get more allocation. But things happen sometimes, projects don't work out or don't close, and that allocation sort of comes back and can be redeployed. Again, I think New Jersey Community Capital is the largest New Jersey specific allocatee. There are multiple national allocatees that act as CDEs for projects in New Jersey all the time. So you do not need a New Jersey specific allocatee. And like I said, depending on your project size, you may need multiple CDEs. It's important. Sometimes it's a little bit of you're trying to figure out sort of, well, how do I go about it and what the timing is. The one thing before you embark on a project or a new market financing is you really have to know your project. This can't be a pie in the sky. Oh, I think I want to build this. Let me see if I can get new market allocation. Because everybody wants to look at a lot of information. And again, especially today, the amount of due diligence that gets done and oversight in your project is immense. They want to know your full capital stack. They want to know where all your sources of financing are coming from. They want to know when they're coming in. They want to know all your project details. They want to know when you're starting construction, when you're completing, who your contractor is. They will look at your construction contract. They'll want to know what your liquidated damages provision is. They'll want to know how much contingency you have and whether it's sufficient. They'll want your contractor to have payment and performance bonds. And then on top of construction, each of these CDEs has certain requirements in their allocation agreements with the CDFI funds to make community benefit. The whole purpose of this program is investment in low-income communities to actually impact the community. So there's a lot of information that needs to be shared about community impact. What jobs are you creating and retaining? What are you, what service or what are you building that's impacting the community that may not have been in that community before? Projects that have sort of the most community impact tend to be, you know, the sort of sexiest, most attractive projects. So right now, you know, healthcare is a big project, or, you know, food sources in a food desert is attractive. Maybe even some kind of new technologies or startups or buildups that are creating a new industry are big. Now, don't get me wrong, warehouses are still being done. Warehouses are still needed, as are, you know, schools, education, but certain CDEs may be more limited in sort of the types of projects that they're willing to do for the sort of limited amount of allocation that they have. And again, just more to that point, you know, the process is after you find CDEs, sharing all this information, you negotiate a term sheet the same way you would with a commercial lender. And then sort of everybody, you know, comes into the project. You have your leverage lender with a leverage loan term sheet. You have a new market investor signed on. You have your CDEs. And then you literally have 10,000 people on a conference call every week going through, you know, a 200-item due diligence checklist, document checklist. And you just move things forward the way you would with sort of any conventional financing. I can tell you that the more different sources of subsidy you have and different programs you're working with, the more complicated it is. You know, I have one new market project now that's just a new market loan and a direct commercial construction loan. And that seems to be, you know, fairly doable. Even that, you're looking probably at 4 to 6 months of lead time to get a deal done. I have another project that has, it has developer equity, it has government funding, it has bond funding, it has new market tax credits, it has federal historic tax credits, and it has state historic tax credits. Once you have all those sources that have to come in, obviously the time frame to get that deal done is going to take longer. There's just a lot more to negotiate, a lot more issues that, you know, need to be solved and dealt with. But you know, being able to say you have $3 million of equity or $10 million of equity, 4 million, whatever it winds up being, can make the difference in your project. Again, in that very complicated project I just mentioned, we thought maybe we wouldn't do new markets, but at the end of the day, really need that net subsidy amount in order to fill in the project gap, just to make the sources and uses work and get the, you know, get the project done. So it's a very useful tool for a project to fill in that gap when you need it. And that's that is it. I don't know if we want to take questions now, or you want to move on and save the questions for the end.
So Lee, I think if there are any burning questions about new market tax credits, we can take them now. If not, we can save them for the Q&A session at the end. So Venitra, I don't know if there's anything in the Q&A or in the chat before we move on to our next panelist.
No questions.
Great.
Thanks,
So,
everyone.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was a lot of information, very informative. I love the way everything was mapped out, and I'm excited to share those visuals with everyone so that they can go back for their reference to build out their strategy as they approach any projects that might qualify for new markets tax credits. Moving on, as I'm sure some of you know, navigating and working with historic properties can be an expensive challenge. So we're excited to introduce our next panelist, John Hatch, who will talk to us about historic tax credits. John is a partner with Clark Caton Hintz, a Trenton-based architecture and planning firm, as well as with HX2 Development, a company which focuses on redevelopment projects in Trenton. His 30+ years with CCH, John has managed the design of an array of architecturally significant buildings across the state and the region. His work with HX2 Development includes Roebling Lofts and Roebling Center. All of John's projects address issues of context, civic life, social justice, and sustainability. In addition to his design work, John has written and lectured about such topics as historic preservation, sustainability, structural racism, and urban redevelopment. John received his undergraduate degree from Princeton University, a Master of Architecture degree from the University of Virginia, and a certificate in historic preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. He serves on the boards of Passage Theater, the Capitol Philharmonic of New Jersey, the Trenton Historical Society, and several others. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Hatch.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm going to try to, and hello, everybody. And I'm going to try sharing my screen. I hope everybody sees that. And in a moment, I'm just going to go to slideshow. Okay, I hope that all works. So thank you for that introduction. I won't add anything else other than I've also lived in the city of Trenton for more than 34 years. So the goals of today's presentation are to provide some two real world examples of urban redevelopment projects and how they're financed, how the federal historic tax credit works and how it fits into that financing, and just a brief nod to the new New Jersey State Historic Tax Credit. And I'll just say, I am not an attorney or an accountant, so this is going to be much more visual and less technical. I hope that works for everybody. So the first is the Federal Historic Tax Credit. Its purpose is to encourage the rehabilitation of historic properties in the United States. And it's a tax credit against federal income tax. And to qualify for the tax, the project must be a rehabilitation of a registered historic income producing building that's determined by the Secretary of the Interior through the National Park Service to be a certified historic structure. So that means it needs to be either individually listed on the state and national registers of historic places, or a contributing structure within a registered state and national historic district. The project is tax credits projects are reviewed by the State Historic Preservation Office, which gives initial certification, and then that's passed on to the National Park Service for review to ensure that the work complies with the Secretary's standards for rehabilitation. And those are guidelines for how historic properties should be treated in order to qualify for this tax credit. The IRS ultimately is the entity that defines qualified rehabilitation expenses on which the credit may be taken. And just to be clear, these cannot be owner-occupied residential properties. These must be income-producing properties. So rental residential, rental commercial projects that produce income that is taxable. A relatively recent, change is under the previous administration is these credits are now earned over 5 years. They used to be, you used to be able to take them in the first year, but they're now earned over 5 years. And as Leah mentioned, this, along with some other factors, has meant that when you're syndicating these tax credits, when you're selling them to investors so that the tax credit can be used as part of project equity, the price now is much lower than it used to be. So on one of the projects I'm going to show, we actually sold the tax credits under the old rule for more than $1 for each dollar of tax credit. And on our most recent one, we sold it for about 75 cents on the dollar. So that's a huge change that has to be taken into account. The NJEDA, the state has come out relatively recently with a state historic tax credit. The Historic Property Reinvestment Act. So the thing about the federal historic tax credit, it is pretty straightforward. If you meet, if it's an income producing property, if it's on the state and national registers, if you show that the work meets the Secretary of the Interior standards, it's a pretty typical process. And sorry, there was a question on the chat. Does the project need to be currently income producing? It does not. When the work is completed, it needs to be income producing. The state historic tax credit is, I'm now seeing, is much more modeled on things like the new market tax credit. And so it's a larger tax credit, 40% typically, again, on registered properties, 40% of the cost of rehabilitation up to a maximum of $4 million unless you're in a government restricted municipality like Trenton, or I think Passaic and Atlantic City. In that case, it can be a 45% tax credit up to 8 million. The issue is for folks that are used to dealing with historic tax credits, because the federal one is so straightforward. There aren't, it needs to be over the course of the 5 years, it needs to keep the characteristics of the rehabilitation. So within those 5 years, you can't rip out the historic windows or completely change the project. So after 5 years, it needs to basically look like it did when completed. But that's really the only requirement. There are a number of, at the state historic tax credit, the Historic Property Reinvestment Program, there are a number of clawbacks. And the reason why the tax credit is so high is that it requires prevailing wage, which adds significantly to the cost of the project. The federal historic tax credit does not require prevailing wage. And there aren't other onerous, from my point of view, requirements at the state level. So at the federal level. At the state level, there are a number of clawbacks. You have to show that the project meets certain wage requirements, and then not only during construction, but also for the first, I forget if it's 10 or 11 years of the project's operating, the folks that are working in the project have to be shown to be paid prevailing wage. All of that adds to the cost of the project. And at least we've found so far that investors in historic tax credits have been leery about investing in the state tax credit because of those clawbacks. So now I'm going to go back to federal historic tax credit. So I'm going to talk about 2 projects that we have completed in the John A. Rolling Sons Wire Rope District, Block 3 Wire Rope District. So this is where it's located. It's at Route 129 and Hamilton Avenue in Trenton. The block is part of a larger historic site very close to downtown Trenton. We are the developers of Block 3. So some of the other projects that we've worked on, that I've worked on as architects, neighboring site, Roebling Market, Pelletier Homes is a senior housing for the city of New York, for the city of Trenton. This is a Roebling Machine Shop, which is kind of an event space for the city. But this is Block 3. Which we listed. It was not listed on the state and national registers of historic places. We listed the site in order so that we could take advantage of the federal historic tax credit. So this is what the site looked like. It has 5 historic buildings, Building 114, Building 101, which is now Roebling Lofts, 104 and 105, which are the boiler house and machine room, Building 110, which we've also just completed for Princeton Hydro, and Building 114, which we're just starting work on. So the goal is to make this whole block into, redevelop it like has been happening in a lot of cities across North America, make it an urbane mixed-use district, and like the Toronto Distillery District, which has very similar buildings. And so because the federal historic tax credit, its purpose is to encourage historically appropriate renovation work, rehabilitation work, it's ideal for us because that's what we want to do anyway, and it will help close the funding gap for the work that we want to do. So this is a little bit earlier version, but just shows how we've been thinking about the site. And really how, and it's a mix of new construction and historic rehabilitation. The project that we've finished is Building 101, Roebling Lofts, 138 units. And then the other project I'm going to talk about is Building 110, which we've also largely finished. So the whole project includes first Roebling Lofts, and I'm just showing you so you can see how many pieces, the capital stack, how many pieces we needed to make each phase work. So Roebling Lofts, which is now open, 138 residential loft apartments, about 42 million, 141, 42 million project costs. We have a federal historic tax credit. We used at the time a New Jersey multifamily ERG that was a state tax credit. We have private financing, bank financing, and then of course, owner developer equity. Building 110, which is now partially complete, and we're about to embark on completing the rest of it. It's a 3-story historic building built in 1908 for the former carpenter shop. We've now leased the 2nd floor, and this we've used much simpler financing. So we've used the federal historic tax credit, private financing, bank financing, and equity. And we did this, we did not go after the New Jersey historic tax credit, and we didn't go after the state's Aspire program tax credit or the Emerge tax credit because of time constraints and also because of prevailing wage requirements and other requirements. So we kept it very simple on Building 110. Building 114, which we're just starting work on, a $4.5 million shell, $29+ million total cost. We're looking to lease this for pharma use, historic tax credit, perhaps the New Jersey historic tax credit, the state's Emerge tax credit, which is a tax credit for jobs created, bank financing, and equity. And then buildings 102 and 103, that's new construction and residential. So I'm going to first look at building 110, Roebling Lofts. This is what it looked like when we acquired the site. It had been vacant for many, many years, a number of fires inside, but the building as a historic industrial building was very solid. And so we put together the project, 138 loft apartments. It's now completed. It's been up and running for a number of years. We've stayed fully occupied through COVID, which we're very proud of. And so just from the exterior, so the building, in order to meet federal historic tax credits, in order to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, the building had very large steel windows. Those were in terrible shape. They couldn't be reused. And so what we did was worked with the State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service to find replacement windows that were used insulated glass that were less expensive than steel windows. These are actually aluminum windows that were designed to look very much like the steel windows. We repaired the exterior brickwork and kept the appearance on the outside as close to the original as possible. So that's meeting the Secretary of the Interior standards. And so here's a nice evening shot. We also, part of our financing was we also got some tax credits for the solar panels. On the inside, the building was used for manufacturing and engineering of small diameter wire rope. Here you get a sense of the condition of the building, solid, but not in good condition. We kept features like the historic fire stair and this gantry crane in the main lobby, again, to meet the federal, Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. These are what the apartment units like, taking advantage of those large windows, keeping the ceiling and the structure exposed. This is a mezzanine of the lobby. You can see the original brickwork, the exposed steel structure, all helped us to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. On the top floor, there had been a testing machine to test the strength of the wire rope that was manufactured there. We kept that machine. This was a big part of how we could meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. And this is now the lounge for the fourth floor lounge for the loft building. So in broad terms, we got a New Jersey multifamily ERG tax credits for about 11.5 million, bank financing through two banks of 16.3 million, equity, owner and investor equity of 5.7. The federal historic tax credit was totaled 8.2 million, although that's not what we got for it. And then we also had a federal income tax credit for the solar panels. Now, the federal historic tax credit, if the owner group can use it, they can use the full 20% tax credit against their income taxes. For projects of larger scale, that's usually not feasible. So, the tax credit is syndicatable, you can sell it to historic tax credit investors. And it has a similar structure that what Leah was talking about, some aspects of new market tax credit. So this historic for the IRS, so that they are comfortable issuing the tax credit to the historic tax credit investor, which is not the developer of the project or the owner. The historic tax credit investor ends up owning 99% of the master tenant lease for the 5-year compliance period. At the end of the compliance period, the investor ownership is automatically reduced to 5%. And at that point, the developer buys out the investors 5% for the put, which is the lesser of 5% of the historic tax credit investment or fair market value of 5% of the project ownership interest. And in practice, that is typically 5% of the amount invested by the historic tax credit investor. The master tenant leases the building from the landlord, the developer, and then releases it for that 5-year period to the end users. And the historic tax credit investor has no ownership stake in the landlord, in the developer. So there are other variations to it, but that's how we've worked it. And we really depend on good counsel. We depend on an accountant who has worked with federal historic tax credits, and we work with a syndicator who finds investors, historic tax credit investors, that can use the historic tax credit against their income taxes. The other thing that it's important to do, because this is based on complying with design standards, with the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation of historic properties, it's important to find an architect that has experience working with those standards. They have to submit 3 parts for certification to the State Historic Preservation Office and to the National Park Service. So it's important that those are done properly and get through that review process. So I'll quickly go through the second. I see that there is a question. So the question is, what is the approximate total return of the historic tax credits to the investors? So the money that they make is the difference between what they pay for the tax credit and what the tax credit is worth. So right now they typically pay something like 75 or 80% of the value. And so that's what they make. And there are some other return that they can get, but that's basically the answer. And the second question is, can the federal historic tax credit be used if the building is in a national and state district? Yes, if the building is a contributing structure in a state and national district, the federal historic tax credit can be used. It does not need to be individually listed. Okay, building 110. This was a carpenter shop. It was in terrible, terrible shape, as you can see from these photos. There's what it was supposed to look like when it was finished. And this slide shows, our press release when we found the first tenant. The tenant is taking the top floor, about 9,000 square feet. And that lease allowed us to move forward with the overall completion of the shell and fitting out the second floor. So this is what the building looks like now. So again, on the first floor, we actually restored these historic windows, wood windows. On the second floor, those are new wood windows with insulated glass that look just like the original. This light monitor on the top floor, which provides skylight for the upper floor. Again, those are new wood windows, insulated glass that look like the original. Again, the doors are generally not original, but they are new wood ones that match the original. So again, all of this was done to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. Another view. And on the interior, we did the same thing. So we kept the original structure where we could. New structure was added to match the original. And lots of stuff was left exposed and original features left. And this worked perfectly with Princeton Hydro. They are an environmental consulting firm. And so they love the aesthetic, and it's really beautiful, beautiful space. This is new wood flooring that is similar to, but not exactly like the original. It's to indicate that it's new. Again, that was done to meet the Secretary of the Interior standard for the treatment of historic properties. So for this one, there are 3 floors total, about a little over 24,000 square feet. Second floor is now leased. The total project cost is almost $6 million, $3.7 million in bank financing, $1.3 million in equity. It's a little more complicated than that. $840,000 in federal historic tax credits. So much simpler capital stack, and we could make that work by controlling our construction costs and through the federal historic tax credit. Now we're working on, just so you see, building 114. We're going to be using a variety of financing sources, and we're just starting the leasing process, looking for pharma, either research, manufacturing, or a combination, or an office use. And so again, we're going to leave the structure, the exterior is going to be restored. And then we have new buildings going on the site, which need to fit the character of the historic district. So this is a proposed building 102, which is all residential. So that is my presentation. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them, or we can move to the low-income housing tax credit.
Well, thank you, John. Those projects are absolutely beautiful and are certainly going to contribute to the growing character of the area, while also preserving the historic ambiance that it's so known for. So thank you for that informative presentation. Next up, and closing out our panel, is Chris Paul, who will share some useful information about how low-income housing tax credits can be useful for your project. So Chris Paul is a principal at Diamond & Associates. She works with multifamily developers to implement their real estate visions. She knows that quality, affordable housing is a right for all and has worked tirelessly since 1999 to support the development of it. She joined Diamond & Associates in 2014, where she has advised for-profit and nonprofit developers primarily within Pennsylvania. Her low-income housing tax credits transactions have ranged in size from $9 to $50 million. I'm sorry, $9 to $50 million, with 31 to 225 units, and have included 9% transactions and tax-exempt bond transactions with 4% low-income housing tax credits transactions. She's also worked on owner-occupied projects in Philadelphia. She's successfully secured multiple affordable housing program funding awards from various federal home loan banks to assist in bringing various projects to fruition. She's played a pivotal role in expanding Diamond's footprint beyond Pennsylvania and New Jersey, securing funding for and closing Diamond's first 9% development in Delaware, and working with developers on projects in New York State. She was promoted to principal in 2019, and in that role, she continues to lead and mentor newer Diamond staff while continuing to manage complex housing development projects. Thank you for joining us, Chris, and I will turn it over to you. Chris, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that.
It's okay.
I thank you very much for the intro. Sorry, I left you with such a long bio, but I appreciate the intro. And I want to make sure that everybody can see the slideshow here.
Yes, it looks great.
Great. Okay, great. Well, hello to everyone. Sorry that we can't see you, but glad that you're here. And I'm here today to talk about low-income housing tax credits as a tool for financing multifamily affordable rental housing. And as you know, Natalie just said, at Diamond, we specialize in assisting developers using the credit as a centerpiece, though we also work with the companion sources and homeownership funding sources and developers as well. Credit program has been around since 1986. And for my purposes, I'm going to say tax credit a lot. And I mean low-income housing tax credit. I know we're here about all the other tax credits too, but sometimes we shorten it to tax credit. So the LIHTC program was created to bring private investment to affordable housing. And it was set up as a market-driven program in which the value of the credit fluctuates in worth depending on the market and the project. As noted, in new markets and historic, they're also subject to similar kinds of fluctuations. The IRS is foregoing the collection of income tax in exchange for construction and rehabilitation of affordable rental housing via these credits. And for investors, the credit is a dollar for dollar reduction of their tax liability, no matter how much they pay for it. And they also are able to enjoy losses and deductions to increase their investment yield. So this slide, is partially just, as Leah's slides were, sometimes the charts are so confusing, they're amusing, although New Market certainly has more complicated charts even than we have in the LIHTC world. So just want to illustrate how we get the credit, how we get to the housing basically in this complicated system. So the IRS allocates credits based on population to state housing finance agencies throughout the country. And the state housing finance agencies then allocate the credits to developers via a qualified allocation plan, or QAP. And then when a developer has those credits in hand, the developer seeks investors or syndicators to invest in their project in exchange for the credits, which the developer often can't use. And then the investor provides equity to construct the housing in exchange for the credit. So the federal government is offering the credit in exchange for the promise to keep rents affordable to those at 60% AMI or below, with a caveat of 80% in the average income world, which we'll get to. And, in the end, then you get the beautiful buildings. And that's the only beautiful building on my slide, so enjoy it. The qualified allocation plan, sometimes referred to as a QAP, also as QAP, outlines the priorities for a given state and sets criteria for award of credits, sets out application deadlines. It often creates set-asides establishes how the credits will be distributed geographically. Any preferences that are established would be noted in the QAP. Points for certain items which reflect the priorities of the state in a given year. The QAP is the starting point for accessing the credits and the equity that they'll generate. I'd want to note a nonprofit set aside is required by the code, but different states may exceed the required 10% nonprofit set aside, but all should have that base requirement. So how does LIHTC work for the developer outside of the flow chart? So the 9% credit can cover 70 to 90% of project costs, and that, as with everything in the tax credit world, depending on the market. The 4% LIHTC, when used in bond deals, will generally cover 30 to 40% of project costs, again, depending on market, and could be lower. And they will require that over 50% of project financing comes from tax-exempt bond debt. And equity is a whole number that's laid out in your budget as a permanent source in total, but it's critical to understand that the timing of the equity is really has an impact on how much an equity price is worth. So equity is almost always scheduled to come in over the course of a project, from closing to 3 or more years later, depending on stabilization dates and lease up dates, et cetera. The tax credit price, therefore, isn't necessarily clear on its face. If you were to offer 90 cents for a project, but you are proposing that your equity is almost all coming in at stabilization or later, my costs will increase because I'll need to borrow money to bridge all my costs while I'm waiting for your equity to come in. And so that, when you do the math, you find, oh, well, maybe that 90 cents is only worth 88 cents, 87 cents or less. And conversely, if you structure your equity proposal to me in a way that does away with my need for bridge financing, that could be worth more to me because of just other cost savings in not just interest, but in transaction costs from lawyer review of documents, et cetera. So with low-income housing tax credit equity, it's not just the price alone that matters, because you really have to find out, well, that price plus when is the equity coming in, that has an impact on what the project costs. So how LIHTC works for investors, as I said, it's the market. In the beginning, before I was involved in low-income housing tax credits in the 1986, 87, 88, years, there was pricing below 50 cents. So $1 was being sold for 45 cents sometimes. And over the years, I have witnessed a lot of fluctuation. Since '99, there's just been a range of changes that really have a dollar impact on the viability of projects. So just selecting a few highlights, in 2015 and 2016, I can remember pricing over $1 in the hotter markets of Philadelphia, New Jersey, New York, and California, maybe seeing $1.20 or more. Big. Good pricing. Those were good days. In 2008, I closed the deal at 65.5 cents. Not so good. That's a big, if you take your calculator out and we'll get to a slide on how to calculate equity, you see that translates into a tremendous difference in dollars. Following the election of 2016, within a week or two of the election itself, pricing dropped by 15 cents in this area. And so it really can be a roller coaster, and it has a real world impact on the project. So the investor will get its dollar for dollar reduction no matter what it pays. And it will also be getting return based on time value of money by delaying capital contributions, and then losses and deductions related to ownership. So when investors have paid more than $1, they definitely have not lost money from that investment. They just are most likely accepting a lower rate of return. And in the times when we had 65 cents rates of return, were investors were requiring much higher rates of return. So that's another, place where the market sort of fluctuates. So the program is about, maintaining affordability in housing. So the credits are basically in exchange for a promise of affordability. And there are now 3 set-asides in the code. There's the 2050 set-aside, and then there's the 40-60 set-aside. And I would say the 40-60 set-aside was the set-aside that we saw almost all developments use and elect, even when the aim of the developer was to serve a much lower income population. They would tend to still select 40-60. Recently, I think it was in 2018 or 19, average income was added to the mix as a third set-aside possibility. And that's why I said the 60% AMI with a caveat. Prior to the average income set-aside, no tax credit unit would ever be made available to someone whose income exceeded 60% AMI when they were signing their lease. Now that there's an average income set-aside, a tenant could have up to an 80% AMI income. They could be at the 80% level and sign a lease, provided that this set-aside is the one elected and the overall average remains at 60% AMI. So it is still the case that 60% AMI is kind of the ceiling in tax credit projects. The average income set-aside just allows greater flexibility and more of a mixed income feel to a project that would be considered 100% affordable if it's 100% LIHTC, but could serve folks at much lower incomes as well as folks at 80% AMI. So the affordability commitment that you're making is often longer than the 15 years that your investor will be in the project with you, with the extended use periods, and those vary from state to state. The land use restriction agreement is how the affordability commitment is codified against the real estate. And the rents that are set based on a given income tier to not exceed 30% of income at a given tier. The flaw in the program is that rent subsidies do not automatically attach with tax credits. So many projects are able to access rent subsidies as well, but it is not a given in the program. And therefore, if you are a tenant whose income is lower than the income in your targeted tier by a little or a lot, you'll be paying more than 30% of your income in rent, which is, by definition, not considered affordable under the federal definition. So there are some vocabulary terms that I think I found, daunting when I started in this world. And so I like to just, familiarize folks with them a little so that it doesn't seem as daunting, because I think sometimes the program seems to have been set up to try to confuse people at times, or that's what we feel like when we worked in it a lot of years. But so just running through some of the terms that get bandied about. Basis is a generalized tax term that you may have encountered outside of affordable housing. In the LIHTC world, costs which are an eligible basis count towards the calculation of the tax credit amount. And the most costs that are allowed in eligible basis, which relate to the building, notable ineligible basis costs would be land, tax credit syndication costs, perm loan related costs, post-construction costs, and some portions of site work or off-site improvements. Qualified basis is the percentage of low-income units to overall units times eligible basis. And so if your development is 100% low income, your eligible basis and qualified basis numbers would be the same if you are developing a mixed income project or working on a preservation development where some of the households who stay have higher incomes, then your qualified basis number would be lower based on the fraction of non-affordable units, or I mean of affordable units over total units. The applicable percentage is 4% for 4% for the acquisition and tax exempt bond related credits, and 9% for the competitive credits for new construction and rehab. I kind of skipped over applicable percentage in my mind and in my notes, and probably should have deleted from the slide, because now that the 4% and 9% rates are both fixed, this is an easier question. The 4% rate only became fixed in the last 2 or 3 years. Prior to that, you had to be sure to check regularly what the rate was so that you could update your budget. So that was another factor adding into the uncertainty of your budget. But now both the 4 and 9 have become fixed. The placed in service is another term that's a general tax term, but in the 9% world, the credits have strict deadlines for use, and often the placed in service date is when the certificate of occupancy is in hand, but there are exceptions for certain expenditure thresholds can be when a project is considered to place in service. The law does require that the credits be placed in service in the year they're awarded. And I think when the program was conceived, it was thought that project costs would be paid with short-term debt and equity would come in late, at the end of the game. So you win the credits and you've already gotten your project built. That's not how things go these days for all of my time in the program. And so the law had always allowed this carryover option, which is to allow the credits to be carried over for 2 years from the year of the credit, as long as you execute a carryover agreement and meet a 10% test. And so that just adds a little bit of work. And I don't think it's on anybody's radar to fix that, but to me that would be a nice thing to fix, to just allow automatically the 2 years. And the 10% test requires 9% to have incurred 10% of reasonably expected basis by a certain date. It was a much tougher threshold, a much tougher thing all around to meet carryover and 10% tests, because the timeframes, maybe 15 or 20 years ago were in the same year, and that was pretty hard. Now the IRS had went through several extensions, and generally speaking, a lot of deals we see are on the cusp of closing or have already closed when they have to meet their 10% test. So it's still a little bit of work to get your accountant to prove that you met the 10% test, but you don't have as much like heartburn, I guess, is what we used to have much more of. Just wanted to point out that tax credit budgets will have, typically multiple columns because in addition to your sources and uses for, what it costs to get the deal built and, where are you getting the money from, you have to, calculate rehab basis and acquisition basis in order to help calculate the credits, which end up being a source, as a result of those basis calculations. So they're just they're more complicated. And I think that's why often there are consultants involved in if developers are not doing tax credit deals, every year, they'll often need the assistance of a consultant because of how complicated the budgeting and the whole system is. So I've talked about the 4% and 9% credits. Getting into a bit more detail, the 4% credits would be used for acquisition in 9% deals, at times if a building is being acquired, but they're more commonly used in tax-exempt bond transactions. And the credits are, as of right, accompanying the volume cap, but the bond cap or volume cap may be competitive or limited. And 9% credits are used for new construction and rehab, but not for acquisition of a building. And for years, as I said, they had these floating rates and are now both fixed. So I promised a slide about calculating tax credit equity. And here it is. I chose $1 million just for ease of math, as I think Leah did as well. The total tax credits would be this number here. The limited partner share is almost always going to be 99.99%. So you multiply, by that number. The credit will be taken over 10 years. And so $1 million in credits, you're going to multiply, also by 10 years, and it would be 10 million in credits before the limited partner share. And then the critical piece here is the pricing, depending on the economy. So I think 90 cents is a little low for today in Philadelphia and New Jersey, but not low for for a rural place, in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. I think it's the market is often driven by the CRA need of banks. And so the places where banks have more CRA need are going to command higher pricing, and those with less, with fewer banks with CRA need, you're going to have the pricing falling lower. So we're definitely seeing, pricing in the 80s on some deals in our office. But then we're also seeing, pricing in the 95, 96 cent range as well. So this has a huge impact. I definitely suggest you play a little with different pricing to see, how much of an impact it has, because it really, it leaves you with some question. You apply for credits and most often don't have a real binding commitment for equity pricing. And if you apply for credits thinking your pricing will be X, and you are awarded credits and the market has changed, you may have a gap just from without any other prices changing, without construction costs, going as wild as they are now, you would just end up with a gap if the market changed and you had lower pricing commanded from an investor. So it is really is a flaw in the program, in my view, because it does add to the difficulty of making these deals work. I wanted to just run through a quick summary of some recent funding cycle to give a sense of how New Jersey has organized this. And I think you would see in any state kind of similar set aside preferences guidance, mostly set forth in the QAP. So I think the family cycle in this round was had the lion's share of it had equal to 50%, at least half of the credits, and you see the maximum allocation, maximum TDC per unit, and then within the family cycle, there would be set-asides with differential maxes based on whether it was mixed income, preservation, and various limits on how the credits will be distributed geographically around the state. The senior cycle in this time had, less than family, but more than supportive housing, you'll see, and also had within it, preservation set aside. So you're, as you begin to think about the kind of development that you want to do, hopefully you're sort of targeting a particular vision, but you have to always pay attention within the QAP to where the priorities are and how that impacts then the fundability of your project. Supportive housing cycle had the least amount of credits, and a max award that was lower than than family. So it is, I think the QAPs can be daunting documents, but they're going to be such a treasure trove of initial information as you begin to embark on a tax credit project. And then there was a final cycle for leftovers. So just helpful to to know that you're going to have to be on the lookout for all of the various ways that that the state has decided that any given type of project can score or access credits, and build those into your plan, so you don't, for example, decide to do a supportive housing deal and expect that you'll get 1.75 million in credits in that round if the cap is 1.4, for example. So I think we don't have information yet about the 2023 timeline, or didn't as of the governor's conference recently. I think what was announced is that it's expected that apps will be due in late summer or early fall, but there wasn't definite, there's not a definite time frame is what I got. So in 2022 the deadline was in August, and awards are expected in December. And I just want to close this out. I think I've conveyed this in our office. We say the low-income housing tax credits are not for the faint of heart. It is a complicated program housed in the IRS, not HUD, which would tell anybody maybe that's going to make it more complicated. And so it isn't for the faint of heart, but it is our major production mechanism for affordable housing in the United States. So it is what we have, and what you will most likely need to use if you are developing affordable rental housing. And so it's just important to kind of understand the program somewhat, and then and know that you're going to be embarking on a little bit of pain and suffering, but you will get that beautiful building at the end of the day, housing tenants that you are aiming and hoping to house. So I think that is it for my slides. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I don't think I saw any questions, but I hope I didn't miss any.
So thank you, Chris. That was a lot of great information. I would love to open up for some brief questions. If anybody has any burning questions, please feel free to either drop them in the chat or in the Q&A section. This can be for any of our speakers today. If there's something that you did not happen to drop in during their individual presentations, please feel free to do so now. In the meantime, as we wait for any questions to come through, I want to take the time to thank all of our speakers today for their contributions in making this such a robust discussion. I want to thank the members of our team, without which we could not make these sessions happen. So I want to give a special shout out to our consultant, Craig Sawyer, our project specialist, Benitra Lewis, and finally, Oscar Parham, our Chief Strategy Office here at the New Jersey Redevelopment Authority. He unfortunately could not be here today, but we had a great conversation, and I'm looking to brief him about what a wonderful panel we had today. So I don't see any questions in the chat or in the Q&A. I know that we will be passing along the slides following the session and some contact information in case you guys think of any questions following the session. So I want to just close out by saying we know how challenging it can be to get your funding strategy in order for your projects. And so in addition to considering how you can incorporate these various types of tax credits into your projects, I invite you to reach out to the NJRA's business development professionals to learn more about our various financing programs that might fit the bill for a current or upcoming project. So I'll share some information about where you can find additional info about their programs into the chat momentarily. I just wanted
Natalie?
to, yes, sir.
I just saw that there was one additional question, or a couple of questions maybe, so.
Got it. So I see one question from Lisa Griffin in the Q&A, and she asks, how can I get a real estate litigation attorney? Do we have any experts on that would like to answer that?
I guess I'm this is Leah. So it somewhat maybe depends on what your matter is, but you can certainly give me a call offline. We could see if we can help you out. We have a litigation department.
Great. Thank you, Leah. We will certainly, Lisa, we will pass along Leah's contact information to you. I've just uploaded a PDF into the chat for our business development services. Craig asked in the chat, can you share how the 4% low-income housing tax credit can be combined with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac products?
Briefly, yes, I can. I mean, I think that both Fannie and Freddie have a tax-exempt loan product to compete somewhat with the FHA products, 221D4 and 223F. And I think that both Fannie and Freddie have, created their product to basically beat the FHA timelines. Their interest rates are going to be slightly less competitive. Their interest rate in terms are going to be slightly less competitive than the FHA terms, but the time frame for FHA can be grueling and difficult and hard to layer in with the difficulties of a tax credit deal. So many folks do 4% deals with FHA financing, and I think it can also use them on 9%. And I would say Fannie and Freddie may also have have a 9% product as well as their 4% products. But they're, and I will, Fannie and Freddie are also investing in the tax credits. So they are impacting, prior to 2008, they had really driven the market in many ways because they were buying on the secondary market the credits from, the investors with which we interface. During their receivership, I think they were out of the scene for a little bit and have recently come back and have direct funds with folks. So they are, I think again will bring heft and shape to the market by the choices that they make. So, but yeah, I would say, I'm closing right now a Freddie TEL tax exempt loan, and it's certainly easier than FHA, maybe not as easy as some other products out there. It's got a few, wrinkles that have complicated things. So I would still recommend people to check it out, but you also want to check out, are there other alternates in the 4% world for debt? Does that help, Craig, or do you have other specific questions?
All right, Craig, if you are answering, you are muted. So I just want to make sure that we're not we're not missing here.
No, perfect. It was a question that was asked, and I want to make sure it was communicated during this session. Thank you.
Great. All right, so I do see one additional question in the chat. I'm not too sure who that question would go to. I'm actually a little unclear about the question, but the question itself is, where can we take criteria to have contributors? And I don't know if that is concerning the last panel, but if the questioner can clarify the question or ask some or have any follow-up information. Craig asks, John, can a historic church qualify for a historic tax credit program when the end use is for religious purposes with some commercial activities?
So I don't know exactly. I haven't run across that. So I will give a counterexample. So my office is located in the historic Trenton Masonic Temple. And so it is not a religious organization, but it's analogous in that the entire building had been property tax exempt. We are leasing essentially one floor from the Masons, and our work, the work that we did on the building and in our space, and because we set up an entity so that it could be income producing, we're able to take federal historic tax credit. So I believe it may be possible, but complicated.
Can I jump in for a minute?
Yeah, please.
No problem. So there are prohibitions and restrictions on tax exempt use property in the historic tax credit world. So some of the issue is not quite so much on the religious side, but more on the tax exempt side. Most churches are qualified tax exempt organizations for multiple reasons. The entity that owns the building has to be taxable, a taxable entity for purposes of claiming the historic tax credits, right? So your tax credit investor who's going to come in and take a 99.99% ownership interest in that entity has to be a federally taxable entity so that the tax credit investor can claim their credits. Obviously, a tax exempt entity would not have any tax credit liability by which the credits can be claimed. So that's why that entity has to be taxable. And then even on top of that, there are restrictions. If you had leases to a church, there are restrictions on the terms of a lease that can be to a tax exempt entity. So I think the problems with a church are probably more running into those tax exempt use restrictions. There are some, workarounds. Your tax exempt entities can create taxable subsidiaries. So is it doable? Yes. And then at the end of the 5-year credit compliance period, can you try to unwind the whole thing and have it back in, straight tax exempt ownership? Yes, you can. But again, is it more complicated? Might it result in sort of some extra structuring that you don't maybe want to do? Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Craig says, Leah, how does someone prepare and source a CDE for a new market tax credit deal in this competitive market?
Okay. So, again, I suggest people who have projects go to the CDFI fund website that has a list of CDEs and allocations. Some of it's really either the developer themselves, or again, if you want to spend some money to retain a consultant who maybe has some connections or has experience in this area, to really go ahead and call their contacts, right, at all the kind of CDEs that they've worked with before and say, hey, I've got this great project, here's what it's all about. The best thing the developer can do is really have all their project details in a row, because the CDEs, even sort of right off the bat, want a significant amount of information about the project, about the developer, about experience, about where the rest of your capital stack is, about how shovel ready you are or aren't, what entitlements you have, site control, all of that stuff. The CDEs are going to want to know. So the more you sort of have your project itself kind of tidied up, you're ready to go, you got through site plan approval, you have site control, you have your contractor, signed up, you have most of the rest of your capital stack, and you're looking for sort of this financing gap, those will probably be more attractive and a little bit of an easier sell to potential CDEs than just sort of a, hey, I don't know, I'm just, trying to get a feel for what's out there.
Great. So I know that we're just about out of time. So again, if you guys do have any further questions, we will be passing along contact information so that you guys can reach out to our experts with any burning questions following this session. I want to thank everyone again for tuning in. If you like today's session, I encourage you to stay tuned to our website, njra.us, as we prepare to launch our 2023 Training Institute schedule very soon. We're looking forward to kicking off the year with a conversation on beginner to intermediate project finance, followed by a session on minority developers workshop. So finally, make sure you join us on December 8th for our annual economic outlook session, where we will discuss the economic outlook for 2023, as well as emerging trends in real estate development and small business. Thank you guys so much. And thank you again to our speakers. You guys did a phenomenal job. And I'm so excited that we were able to have you for this session. Thank you all again on behalf of the NJRA.